wrap my arms around Theodore Roosevelt. I disagree with that. I think Roosevelt is one of the most extraordinary men of American history, but of course, not without his faults.
He said some pretty awful things. But again, in the show, we talk about that. And I got to think that through some more. What do you think of my theory about the Jefferson and Roosevelt and the Aryan supremacy of
supremacy is a kind of a loaded term, of course.
But, well, yeah, but you know what I mean.
I want to distinguish them just a little bit, which we weren't able to do in the show. So, yes, they both believe that the Anglo-Saxons are the class act of the world, without question. But there's a slight difference. Roosevelt's views were largely race-based. And there was a time in his life when he flirted a little with the eugenics movement. Jefferson's were different. Jefferson, admittedly, has his own problems here, but Jefferson believed that the European Enlightenment, Scotland, France, England at its best, part of Italy, part of Germany, but the Enlightenment of Europe, with the tradition going back to the Magna Carta and the Glorious Rebellion and the British Bill of Rights and so on, he believed that let's call it software, that civilizational software, was the most enlightened and extraordinary that the world had ever seen, and therefore the people that produced it must be the most interesting people in the world. So Jefferson's lead was more about the rights and liberties tradition, the due process tradition, right, and a little bit less about intrinsic race characteristics. Roosevelt had some of that too, of course. Look at what the Anglo-Saxon people have done. But his was a little bit more about race. And one of the things that had happened between Jefferson's time and Roosevelt's is that there was this whole anthropology of race, and you've talked about it, where people talked about a mongoloid head shape, and there was phrenology, and there was all this talk about skin tone and coloration and Negroid and Mongolian characteristics. All that was post-Jefferson, and it kind of hardened into what we now regard as a pretty reductive and illiberal view of humanity. I
talked on this show about the book by James Bradley, The Imperial Cruise, which has its critics.
I'm one of them, by the way.
In 1774, Jefferson wrote A Summary View of the Rights of British America, a series of complaints against King George, which foreshadowed by 2 years his 1776 Declaration of Independence. Jefferson refers to God twice, but invokes England's Saxon ancestors 6 times in calling for a freer hand from the king. Jefferson writes of their shared, quote, Saxon ancestors who had left their native wilds in the woods of north of Europe and had taken the island of Britain, had established there a system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country. He argued that since the original Saxons were ruled by no superior and were not subject to feudal conditions, the king should lighten his hold on American colonies.
Now, we need Joe Ellis here to laugh at this because Jefferson subscribed to this Anglo theory, which he believed that the source of democracy was not ancient Athens or the Roman Republic. The source of democracy was Northern European Anglo-Saxons, and that these were sturdy individualists. He said they lived in something called hundreds, where there was actual democracy, and that this was way more important to our tradition of liberty than all that stuff about the Mediterranean. Modern intellectual historians, people like Joe Ellis, just laugh at this and say, great myth, Mr. Jefferson. Not true, but nice myth. But Jefferson believed it.
Yeah, and so did Roosevelt.
Yes, but so yes, there's this, of course.
I mean, but I'm just trying to get at the root of why that sort of racism existed in Jefferson and in Roosevelt.
I'd be careful about the word racism, and I'd be careful about the word supremacy, but there's no question that there was a hierarchy of civilization, and that these people, to use a cultural studies term, were privileging Northern Teutonic Europeans and finding fault with Slavic peoples, including Russians, Southern and Eastern Europeans, finding fault with Mediterranean types, finding fault with swarthy Spanish types, looking down on American Indians as locked in a kind of a Stone Age primitivism, looking on black Africans as people who were lost in tribal factionalism and violence and so on. Very, very widespread. And as you know, not entirely absent today from people's thinking. So we always have to look on people as creatures of their time. What you want from the best people like Jefferson is that they somehow chafe against those boundaries and rise above them, or think outside of the box, or think in a more enlightened way. And Jefferson was certainly capable of that. Roosevelt a little less so. But even then, Roosevelt was not straitjacketed by these views.
And I'm sorry to take us here in the conversation because it's again that whole man theory, and it's only part, but it's important to acknowledge that. But really, I mean, for me, Roosevelt is this sickly young kid who overcame it just by physical will and suffered the greatest emotional losses any of us can probably imagine, and came to North Dakota and healed himself on his own, and then became this president who was a champion of the worker, and a trust buster, and who broke up monopolies, and had this long view of preserving the greatest of what he thought that was the greatest of America.
Few people grow in office. Few people grow in life. Roosevelt grew in life. He became more interesting, more sensitive, more thoughtful. He got away a little bit from the big game side of his personality. He truly is one of those people who became more enlightened as time went on. His mind was largely open. And yet, in some ways, he was trapped by the conditions of his temperament and his times. Jefferson was kind of finished by the time he was 25, and then he just played out that glorious Enlightenment software
really interesting.
for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Well, Jefferson wasn't growing and changing. To the extent that he changed, he became hardened later in life, not more tolerant and more open. So these are different things. I always wonder what they're going to say about us in terms of enlightenment and bigotry and things we can't even see in ourselves. Like the log in our eye is
that they actually burned carbon. That's
right.
What
They burned the last of the world's oil.
Yeah.
We've allowed Rwanda to occur. We allow the industrial conditions of Taiwan and the third world to occur. You don't want to look too closely at us. But my point is that if you look on Roosevelt in the broadest possible picture, you have to see him as an extraordinary human being. And here's what I like most about him. He had a zest for living unmatched in any other figure that I've ever encountered anywhere in my reading. This is a person who just, talk about Thoreau, suck out all the marrow of life. Roosevelt wanted to be, like his daughter said, Alice famously said, my father wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. That's such a great line. So let's look favorably on him on the whole, but never forget that he was there. It's not all good news.
We should go to the show, and before we do, I just want to thank all of those of you who decided to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find out more about the book club, some of the upcoming shows, and we'll get into that more next week.
And come visit the Badlands of North Dakota, because it transformed Roosevelt. It's transformed David Swenson. It's transformed me. I think it transforms anyone who lets it. Thanks for listening.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
I am glad to see you, my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I chose this topic. Sometimes you chose the topics. Sometimes I choose the topics. More often we do it together. But I asked you as a personal favor if we could talk about not the third president of the United States today, but the 26th president, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt.
And you are not alone in your request. We got an email from Doug Reed saying, would you be interested in debating? He says, Teddy, I never will. In debating Theodore Roosevelt, the thought occurred to me that a great podcast or series would be a debate between TR and Jefferson. And actually, in checking the files, you did this
I've done
once
this
at the Seattle Library.
I've done it in a number of places. I've actually portrayed three members of Mount Rushmore at times, where I'll just do all of them.
And we also got a letter from Irwin Weeks, who you know well.
Of Dickinson, North Dakota.
So, dear Mr. Jefferson, is it true The only three things you and Theodore Roosevelt agreed on were that the westward movement was a good idea, the Supreme Court is a pain, and Aaron Burr was bad.
That's a witty.
Maybe
Mr. Weeks has written a witty letter.
But it is a good time we're looking at. Isn't it a centennial?
Right. So Roosevelt was born in 1858, but he died on January 6, 1919, at his home at Sagamore Hill on Long Island in his bed. He was 60 years old. That centennial was last week. So we've now reached the period where he has been dead for 100 years. And this gives us an opportunity as a nation to step back and to sort of reassess the life and achievement of Theodore Roosevelt. And I'll tell you one reason why I'm so interested in doing it, David, is that I portray Roosevelt. He's one of the characters that I do. I do quite a bit of it, actually.
Yes, you're sort of a go-to guy in this part of the world. Well, more than this part of the world when it comes to details about Roosevelt's life. Now, I know how seriously you take it when you take on a humanities character, as in Jefferson or many of the other ones. And I would say that Theodore Roosevelt is right up there on the top of your list. Is that
love
fair?
Portraying Roosevelt because he's so zany, crazy, energetic, over the top.
And there's a real connection out to us in North Dakota, too.
That's why I took him on. When I moved back to North Dakota about 14 years ago, I wanted to get to know the state in a new way. I didn't want to just come back. And so I thought, what project can I take on that will enable me to kind of immerse myself in a part of the North Dakota tradition? And so I decided that I would take on Roosevelt because, for those who don't live here, Roosevelt lived amongst us for a couple of years off and on between 1883 and 1887. He came out to kill a buffalo in September of 1883 in the Badlands of Western Dakota Territory. He fell in love with the Badlands and the Little Missouri River Valley and the frontier.
You've been to the spot where this happened, have you not?
And where he shot his first buffalo.
Yeah,
yes,
I have not.
North of Marmarth. I'll take you there. It's right on the Montana line on upper Little Cannonball Creek.
Well, but before we get into all of these details, before we go there, maybe for listeners who don't know much about Theodore Roosevelt, I think it's important to start with his youth because it's so fascinating and what he did to become the man he was.
Now, let me start by saying that Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt have to spend eternity together on Mount Rushmore, and they neither one of them could like this. They represent completely opposite poles. Jefferson, mild-mannered, polite, retiring, believing in legislative supremacy, states' rights,
small government.
And America. He's an isolationist. He's an agrarian. Roosevelt, over the top, executive supremacy. He's basically America's first king. He created the modern presidency. He believed that we had a place in the world, in fact, that we should fill the vacuum that was coming from the decline of the British Empire. He's for big central government, big military, big navy. He's for broad construction of the Constitution. Roosevelt's a Hamiltonian. Jefferson's a Jeffersonian. Jefferson would have found Roosevelt the way he found Andrew Jackson, a bombastic ruffian, probably unfit for high office. But Roosevelt returned the contempt in spades. Roosevelt felt that of all of the presidents, he was the 26th, the one that was probably the least fit to be the president of the United States was Jefferson, and here's why. Two stated reasons and one secret reason. The stated reasons were that Jefferson was a limited government guy, and that may have made sense in 1800, but it made no sense in 1900. Secondly, Jefferson was a believer in strict adherence to the Constitution, and Roosevelt believed the only chance we had was to have a flexible Constitution that we could make things happen with instead of be straitjacketed by. And third, Jefferson was a pacifist, more or less, and Roosevelt actually said on many occasions that Jefferson and his lackey Madison had disarmed the country. They had starved the the military. They had made the War of 1812 inevitable, and when the war finally came, they bungled its prosecution because they didn't understand the most important of all principles, which is that the best defense is a very strong offense.
Well, but he's correct, though, in that they did starve the military, but I think it's kind of a stretch to blame the War of 18. That would have happened regardless of Jefferson's.
Well, not according to Theodore Roosevelt.
Uh-huh.
So here's the secret reason. Roosevelt is famous for you remember, the man in the arena.
Right.
It's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood. A speech he gave at the Sorbonne in October of 1910, his view, which he doesn't state but which you can tell is right there, his view was that whenever there was something going on in the arena, Jefferson slipped away to Monticello. That Roosevelt's the kind of guy who sees a fight and jumps in, no matter what it is. He gets right in there and starts throwing fists. Jefferson is the kind of person who sees tension, not even a fight, but sees tension and slowly pulls away and rides his horse serenely back to Monticello. And so Roosevelt essentially saw Jefferson as a coward. And of course he knew that Jefferson fled from Bannister Tarleton when they attacked Charlottesville and Monticello in 1781, when Jefferson was the wartime governor of Virginia. So these are two polar opposites, and yet they're exactly 100 years apart, and they're both great presidents. But that just proves that you can be a great president at different times with a very different style.
What I was hoping for you to talk about a bit was
his youth
and how sickly he was and how he overcame that.
Roosevelt was a very sickly child. He had asthma at a time when we had no real way of addressing that. And he would be suffocating. He couldn't get oxygen, and it became not only a serious health problem, but it became it was a nuisance in his family because the whole world revolved around the invalid, little TD, with all of his issues. And so when he was 12, we never went to school. He was home educated. He couldn't play in boy sports or rough activities. He was this precious little fragile child, and because of that, it was very disruptive. And finally, his father, whom he worshipped, took him aside and said, "My son, your mind is strong, but your body is weak. You'll never achieve your potential if your body doesn't improve." And then he said, "Son, you must make your body." And little Roosevelt, who was 12, looked up at his father and said, I will, Papa. I will make my body." And so that's the beginning of his run, and he did. He did sit-ups and push-ups and learned boxing and engaged in strenuous activity and eventually overcame most of this. He never overcame it entirely, but Roosevelt became the very epitome of the strenuous man, the hero, the adventurer, the person who was unafraid of anything. And he threw himself into the arena and was not afraid to fight. And he was not afraid to take incredible risks with his health.
I read today, I did not know this, I'm sure you did. As governor of New York, he boxed with sparring partners several times a week, a practice he regularly continued as president until being hit so hard in the face that he became blind in his left eye, a fact which was not made public until many years later. That comes from Wikipedia.
He had a naval officer that would come in, these young, really strong naval officers, pugilists, and Roosevelt would box with them. And he'd wrestle and play sticks and do jujitsu, and he had a whole range of these sort of body arts. But he would say, "Don't hold back, hit me. Hit me, don't spare me." And so one of these naval officers hit him in the eye, and he tore Roosevelt's retina, and at the time there was no repair, so he becomes blind in one eye. But here's what's so amazing about this story. He didn't tell anyone because he didn't want to hurt the officer's career or his feelings. So the guy blinds him, and Roosevelt's like, "I'm not going to talk about this because it might hurt this fellow's life."
So he was permanently blinded.
Never saw through that eye again.
I didn't know that.
And but isn't it amazing that his biggest concern was, what if this guy's career is now stalled because he's blinded me?
I think that's amazing, but I have to go back to hear this 12-year-old saying,
I will, Papa.
Yeah, and actually physically being able to overcome. It'd be interesting to get a medical view on that. Can you overcome asthma?
Not then. You just outlive it. Sometimes when you grow up, the severity of it attenuates.
Right.
But he did have bouts of it later in his life. Today we have all sorts of remedies for it. But one of my closest friends growing up had asthma, and when he would get it, the family would go on into this kind of siege. Is he going to be all right? And he had these vaporizers, and he was rushed to the emergency room. It was still a significant problem, and is, I think, among some, even in our own time.
I've experienced that firsthand, and
that
it
is rough.
No fun.
Because you can't breathe, and you think you're going to die.
Yeah, and if you're a parent watching a child with it.
And so now we have these breathalyzers and so on.
So there's a lot to talk about with Roosevelt, and when we after we take our break here, I'd like to get him to Dakota if we could, and maybe
get him out of his house in Sagamore Hill.
And you could explain to us why he came here.
Indeed.
It was more than just shooting a buffalo in the end.
You are correct. You are correct.
But right now we're going to take just a short break. We will be back in just a moment, and you're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Hello, listeners. We just wanted to sneak in one of our announcements between segments.
People love the books that we recommend on this program, so we have instituted the Thomas Jefferson Book Club on the Jefferson Hour, and the first book will be in February of 2019. It's Akil Reed Amar's book, The Constitution Today.
And you can ask questions about the book if you've read it, or if you just have a general question. The easiest way is to go to jeffersonhour.com and click on Ask a Question. Make note that it's about the book club.
All the other books are listed there. Plus, we'll be doing some interviews with authors like our favorite Joe Ellis. So this is a constant feature once every 6 or 8 weeks on the Jefferson Hour, the Thomas Jefferson Book Club.
We love to hear from you. Again, the Constitution Today, and if you'd like to ask a question, we need it by February 13th. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Get reading.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're talking about Theodore Roosevelt,
the 26th president.
And we started with how different Jefferson and Roosevelt were.
They could not have been more different. I mean, Jefferson is the politest man. He has no discernible ego. There's no virility in him. He's a strong man, and he clearly is a good lover and a person who had some strength of character. But Jefferson is like a Zen master. Roosevelt is right there in your face, and he's loud, and he dominates, he tells stories, he never defers. There's a lot of self-regard. He also has a tremendous sense of humor. He is a talker, and he's a doer, and Roosevelt wanted to make a splash in the world and make America the greatest nation on earth. Jefferson's view is very different. His view is, how about a quiet, farming nation where people read Homer in the original Greek? And Jefferson believed that states were more important than the nation, that we should have a very limited military, that we should be isolationist. And Roosevelt looked on all that and just thought, this guy's nuts. He thought Jefferson was the kind of person who probably could have been a philosopher or the president of an academy somewhere, but that Jefferson did not understand Realpolitik, didn't understand that the world was a dangerous place and that you had to be strong and there were going to be fights and there were going to be wars and you couldn't just negotiate. Sometimes you had to lord it over. And I wanted to say before we go on, the one reason I wanted to do this show is that wherever I go and do Roosevelt, people say, oh, he's like Trump. And I always stop that. And I want to get very serious for a moment. There are some similarities, but here are two essential differences. Roosevelt did everything in his power to get into war. He resigned his office as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His wife begged him not to go. The President of the United States, McKinley, asked him not to go to war. Roosevelt had to bend rules and ride roughshod over other people's protocols. He actually forced his men onto a troop ship in Tampa. He was going to get to war. He believed you cannot be a leader of this country if there's a war in your time that you do not get yourself into.
Conquests further the mission of the race.
But don't get lost there.
Okay.
My point is that he believed that if there is a war and you are an able-bodied person, you get yourself into that war. Secondly, Roosevelt read a book a day all of his life. We know this. He knew 5 languages. He read a book a day. He had a nearly photographic memory. He wrote 40 books. He wrote 155,000 letters. I don't mean any disrespect, but ask yourself this serious question. How many books has Donald Trump ever read?
Well, that also brings up a comparison with Jefferson.
Another great reader.
I've read that their Jefferson and Roosevelt are considered the 2 most well-read presidents.
Maybe John Adams belongs in there and John Quincy Adams, but that's a small list.
The difference is Roosevelt wrote books, like 18, didn't he?
40,
Oh,
depending on how you count, 35
Okay.
or 40. Jefferson wrote 1, but see,
and a
Jefferson...
half. He started his autobiography too.
And actually, if you add it up, they're kind of more like 4, but there's 1 book. And
Jefferson
that's Notes
wrote
on Virginia.
letters.
But only 26,000. Roosevelt, 150,000.
I didn't know that.
And innumerable op-ed pieces and articles. But here's the thing. They're 100 years apart. They're diametrically opposite, but they are 2 of the greatest prose stylists in our history. Very different prose, but Roosevelt's prose is outstanding.
But he wrote books as a way to supplement his income.
He needed the money.
Kind of like Churchill did the same thing.
They
right?
were very similar in that regard. They didn't like each other either, but Jefferson believed as a gentleman that publishing a book was sort of beneath him, whereas Roosevelt's like, no way, I'm going to publish every book I can. I need the money for one thing, but he didn't have that. Jefferson is a very typical 18th century gentleman where many things are beneath his dignity. For Roosevelt, is there anything beneath his dignity?
Well, another difference that reading about him is that we know what Jefferson's feeling on religion was. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was an avid churchgoer.
But I have a friend in San Diego, and she and I debate this. So she wants Roosevelt to be a real Christian. And he certainly was more than Jefferson. But Roosevelt said he went to church so he could sing at the top of his lungs. It was the only place where he could sing and not be rebuked. Huh. But secondly, you read his writings, there is not much talk of Jesus. There's no talk of Christ. He's a muscular, at this time there was known as sort of the Christian militancy, the muscular Christian, the Christian who does good things in the world, who rights wrongs, and he's like a Superman Christian. That's Roosevelt. He believed more than Jefferson, but it is not clear that he wasn't a deist of some sort, although this was not an interest to him. He went to church. He loved it. He got to sing. He was not going to rock that boat. But here's an interesting point. He had Augustin St. Gaudens, the great sculptor, revise our coinage. He wanted a better coinage for the United States. And in the dollar, Roosevelt and St. Gaudens removed "In God We Trust." Roosevelt thought, no, it has nothing to do with God. It's money. Money's grubby. God is God. Congress put it back in because they were much more hypocritical. But Roosevelt's view was, no, let's not confuse mammon and God here. And so he removed "In God We Trust." So if you're adding up presidents who were free thinkers, Roosevelt's one of them. But he's not as much of a free thinker as Thomas Jefferson.
A couple of things. Roosevelt intensely disliked being called Teddy and was quick to point out this fact to those who referred to him as such, though it would become widely used by newspapers during his political career. And I watch like presidential historians on news shows and just wince where they all call him Teddy without a thought.
Even Doris Kearns Goodwin, who should know better, and Michael Beschloss, who should know better. Who doesn't get it right, though, is Douglas Brinkley. He's been out to North Dakota many times. He knows the Badlands. He knew Harold and Shiloh Schaefer. He knows Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Roosevelt hated to be called Teddy for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a diminutive name.
Right.
It's a boy's name. Mm-hmm. It's a child's name. But secondly, his first wife, Alice, who died basically in childbirth, called him Teddy. It was a term of endearment, a pet name. And so for him, it was just like scratching your fingernails on a chalkboard when he heard it, because that was private. And so he wanted to be called Theodore or TR or Colonel or President Roosevelt or Theodore Rex, which is a little over the top.
Anything
but of course,
Teddy.
everyone called him Teddy, and he put up with it because he realized that, if you go to Butte, Montana, and they say "bully for Teddy," they don't know that that's not okay. That's just their way of addressing you in a familiar fashion.
And for those who don't know, you just mentioned the loss of his first wife.
And mother, same day.
Of February 14th, 1884.
So his wife gives birth on February 12th to the notorious Alice, the famous Alice, also named after her mother. His first wife dies at the age of 23, 2 days later, of Bright's disease, which is a total collapse of her kidney function. Roosevelt wrote in his little pocket diary, 2 inches, I've held it in my hands in the Library of Congress, this beautiful little pocket diary. He put a big X through it on that day, and he said, "The light has gone out of my life." And he actually thought, that's it. I can't go on. Of course, he did. He had this enormous physical and spiritual
his
vitality.
His mother as well.
His mother died on the same day. So the two most important women in his life died in the same house on the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884.
Which brings us to Dakota.
So he'd already come to Dakota to kill a buffalo, but he fell in love with it. He came back in the spring of 1884 grieving, and he actually thought then, David, that he might spend the rest of his life out here. He thought, I'm not going back east. That's the scene of sorrow. The new world is the world of the frontier. So he thought he might live
Let me
here.
out of the arena for a while. Right?
So he came here and he got a second ranch, which he called the Elkhorn. And it's very remote even now, as you know. You and I have been there on Valentine's Day, a
we
famous
were years
trip.
ago. Been there many times.
First thing we did after I moved back.
It's a magic place.
So we went there on the actual day, and it's a magnificent remote place. For people who come to North Dakota, let us know, because you need to go to the Elkhorn. It's a sanctuary to a great man, a great president, and to the history of the conservation movement, and to the sanctity of the Badlands, which are under
constant
assault,
threat. Yeah.
threat. Anyway, so he has two ranches now, the Maltese Cross and the Elkhorn. They're separated by about 35 miles. He never owned a single acre here, kind of fell in love with it, and he threw himself into the life of the frontier. And sort of recklessly, he was punching out drunks in bars and arresting boat thieves, and he took a lot of risks. And he got thrown from horses. He was in stampedes. I mean, this is not like going to a dude ranch in Wyoming. This is Roosevelt jumping off the cliff into the heart of frontier life and loving it.
And stop me if I get this wrong, but I've heard it from you, and I think I have it correct. Is it the cowboys that he worked with at that time didn't suffer fools gladly, and they saw this bespectacled young short man as probably one of those fools. But he gained their respect almost universally.
I'll tell you how he did it. It's for me the most moving of Roosevelt's stories, and there are lots of them in Roosevelt. He wanted to be accepted. He didn't create a good first impression. He wore designer buckskins, and he had a knife hand carved by Tiffany's, and he wore glasses, thick ones at that, and he had this weird falsetto accent, "Bully and delighted to meet you," and so on. And so they all thought, who is this moron? This rich guy comes here, he's dabbling out here, he'll leave soon. He wasn't going to let that be. And so he decided to win their respect. And here's how he did it. It's just so powerful. He never shirked a duty during these roundups. If someone needed an extra person to ride night guard, however tired, he would do it. He was never the first at the grub line. He was never the last person to go to bed. He never spoke unless spoken to. He was uncomplaining and indefatigable, and no matter how weary and bruised and bloodied up he was, he got back in the arena. And eventually they thought, this guy's for real. This guy's worth.
Yeah, he may not
seriously.
be real good at it, but he's really making the effort. The story I like so much is Sewell and Dowell were helping
his cabin, yeah.
And they talked about how many trees they had cut down in the day, and what was the line they used?
Dowell says something like, I cut down 52 and Sewell cut down 43, and the colonel, he beavered down 19. You just get this picture of Roosevelt, using the axe in a crazy, inefficient way.
But he did it.
And he did everything in his life this way, that with this gusto and this love of life and this commitment to life as adventure and this belief that no matter how much you're suffering, however painful it is, or when you hit the wall in a marathon, or when you're out there and you're just dying of exhaustion or thirst on the horse, you have to think, this is great. I'm in it. I'm living life. This is what life is. It's an adventure. And it was infectious. People liked it.
Before we leave that Dakota episode, for me, if I might.
Yes, sir.
I think of Roosevelt as this man in absolute agony over the loss of his wife, the loss of his way of life, the loss of his mother. And where did he go? He came to Dakota, and he rode up and found this place, this magnificent place, the Elkhorn, and he healed himself. And that, to me, is like the strength of the Badlands. It's one of those kinds of places.
You know a little bit about healing and grief, so do I. Roosevelt came back. He buried himself in these adventures and in work and in solitude. And he said, nowhere on earth is it more lonely than riding on the plains when you're all alone out there and the wind is blowing in the grass.
You've been there all alone. So have I.
I love it.
And there's something about that spot that when you go stand there where his cabin was or walk to the riverbank that he saw, there is, it's church. It really, and not to get too thick and heavy, but it really is.
It's my church and your church. It's not everyone's church.
No, agreed, but it's one of the reasons we all worry about it being preserved.
And so he went out there, and then he said that he found, when he was looking for this ranch, and there was open country, these were squatters, they were on the open range, and he had been kind of, a man named Howard Eaton had said, there's a place, if you go over there, you think you're going to find what you like. He said he found the horns of 2 bull elks that they'd gotten locked in combat during rutting season, and the 2 alpha males had locked their horns, and because of that, they'd both starved to death. This happens once in a long while. And Roosevelt thought, he was a Darwinist. He thought, that's it. That's what life is. It's struggle. It's survival of the fittest. It's not hyper-civilized. It's not comfortable. Life is an adventure, but it's also struggle. And so he liked that image, the Elkhorn. And then he was there, and he built this, with the help of Dow and Sewell, he built this 30 by 60-foot cottonwood log ranch house. He wrote some books there. He hunted there. He ranched and played cowboy. But he also healed. He found himself, and he became a deeper, more interesting human being.
And when he left, he said, I would never have been president.
He said,
I don't know if that was a pitch or he meant it.
No, he came back in 1910 after his presidency, and he was dedicating a library in Fargo, North Dakota, way on the other end of the state. And he said, and I quote, I would never have been the president of this country had it not been for the time I spent in North Dakota. Well, we North Dakotans,
we claim that.
We grip that thing. I think every North Dakotan is required to learn it at birth. But it wasn't a throwaway sentence. He meant it. And I say, this is the basis of my work on him, David. I believe that Roosevelt became Theodore Roosevelt here. That it was the West, it was the frontier, it was Dakota, it was the Badlands, it was the Little Missouri River. It was that made him the one we think so highly of, that he would have been interesting no matter what. But there was a transformation that occurred out here. He became deeper, more interesting, more tolerant, more respectful. This experience improved him in every way, and my goodness, did he live on it. He went away and exaggerated the amount of time he spent here. He said years. One time he said 15 years he spent out here. Well, it was about 1 year total elapsed time, but mightily important.
Now we get to the point where we look at his presidency, if we might.
Which is almost an afterthought with him. It's like,
but when you start reading about him, it should not be, because he did some amazing things as president that I'm not sure the average American, we all have this sort of cartoony image of him,
the
bully
trustbuster,
and all
right?
that. But he really did, and he looked. I can't agree with everything he did, but I certainly agree with a lot that he did, and it took a lot of guts to do some of the things he did.
Well, he stood up to the Republican oligarchy, the Republican establishment, and he basically became a progressive and said something like this: the country is not going to be okay for the most privileged of us if it's not also okay for the least privileged of us. And so he became a small d Democrat. He was always a Republican.
But he believed that.
He believed that we needed a square deal. And by that, here's what he meant, that if you play poker and the dealer is honest, you might get a good hand or a bad hand. You can't control that. But if the dealer is cheating and handing the best cards to his pals, that's what you don't want. You want a fair umpire in your national government, and you want your government to want the welfare, the regard, the lives of the have-nots to improve. You can't just say, well, that's the way it is, deal with it. He really came to believe that workers had rights. He's the first president to intervene on behalf of labor in a labor dispute. He worked hard so that America could be a place where everyone could thrive, at least up to a degree.
For the time, that was really unheard of.
And he was lucky to get away with it because, the forces of power, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Goulds and the others hated what he represented. But Roosevelt's view was, it's this, reform within capitalism, or it's Bolshevik revolution. Which do you prefer? You can wait and have a revolution, or you can let me fix a few things around the edges.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion on Theodore Roosevelt. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. I want to invite you to come on the John Steinbeck Cultural Tour in Monterey, California, March 2nd through 8th, 2019. I do these cultural tours on the Lewis and Clark Trail in Jefferson's, Virginia, and soon Jefferson's, France. But the one that's immediately in front of us is John Steinbeck's America in California, in Monterey, 2 through 8 March 2019. Go to the website jeffersonhour.com/tours, and you can get all the information. Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, the Red Pony, Cannery Row, Of Mice and Men, and we'll be visiting some of the most extraordinary places on the coastline of California. We'll see you there.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation. Well, this week our conversation is about Theodore Roosevelt, some comparisons with Thomas Jefferson, and I can't help but bring up that there were some dark sides, both to Jefferson and to Theodore Roosevelt.
So there are lots of things that one could say against Roosevelt. But on the issue of race, two things. One is that he did invite Booker T. Washington to dine with him in the White House and caused a national uproar over it, and was actually quite courageous in denouncing lynching and appointing African Americans to posts in the South and so on. But he was a paternalist who believed that black people were really, at least temporarily, inferior, and that it would take a long time before they ever caught up and so on. And that's the better of his racial views. With respect to Native Americans, and I know this really matters to you and to me, it should matter to everyone, but he was almost unrelentingly a man of his time, and maybe more than that, in his way of characterizing Native Americans as primitive, savage, violent, etc. And I won't even quote the worst things that he said about it. But he did say in his book, his 4-volume masterpiece, if you can call it that, The Winning of the West, he said that the conquest of American Indians was a righteous thing, that it was important, that it was good. We should not apologize for it. It was no different from the conquest of Africans by the Dutch and by the British. It was no different from the conquest of the natives of New Zealand and Australia by people of English extraction, that this was the world's work. You can summarize it by quoting Kipling, that it's the white man's burden. He was unapologetic about this whatsoever. He said awful things were done on both sides, but on the whole, this is the world's work being done by the people who deserve to lead the world. And so when we hear those things in our time, David, we cringe.
I've been thinking about this a great deal in both in regards to Jefferson and to Roosevelt. There's a book called The Imperial Cruise by James Bradley, which is it's pretty hard on Roosevelt, to say the least.
The Roosevelt community really dislikes that book.
But in the beginning of it, he talks about the belief in Aryan supremacy.
No question.
And I think both Jefferson And there's evidence of that in his talking about the Saxons in Europe and Theodore Roosevelt. That was something they grew up with that was ingrained in them. And it almost, to me, it's almost like it started there. Roosevelt came to Dakota. He had interactions with cowboys who had had very bad interactions with Native Americans. This was 10, 15 years after the
Little Bighorn. So there's still a lot of testosterone in white culture.
And you and I both know that still exists 100 years.
And it was heading towards Wounded Knee, a payback for the Little Bighorn.
I almost, I have to rethink this, and I haven't completely, but I almost think that there's something in that Aryan supremacy that men like Jefferson and Roosevelt grew up with, and then it was reinforced over and over and over again. And I want to be careful to, again, it's the whole man theory, but that is part of Roosevelt as much as it is Jefferson.
Well, Roosevelt lived in the age of Buffalo Bill Cody and George Armstrong Custer and Nelson A. Miles and Sherman and Sheridan and so on. We were still conquering the continent then. We were filled with all of this testosterone and this righteousness and this idea of manifest destiny, and Roosevelt fits in that. So we need to see him in that context. I will say that there's a love of violence and conquest in Roosevelt's character, and you can wrestle around it and try to make sense of it and say that he was a man of his time, but some of it seems a little deeply woven into his basic sense of manhood.
But there's so much more to talk about with Roosevelt. I don't want to get stuck on that. I just wanted to bring it up because, his trust busting, and we haven't even touched on his conservation. He was talk about a pioneer in a field that's at that time didn't really exist, did it?
Roosevelt was an incredibly powerful individual and a determined one, and you have to ask, if he had never lived, would we have the national park system that we have, the national monuments, the wildlife refuges, and so on? And the answer is probably no. McKinley wouldn't have done it. Wilson didn't do it. Taft didn't do it. This is one of those instances where one individual had an enormous effect on a civilization and the world, because the national park system of the United States is the model for the world, the template, and it's the envy of the world. This is really Roosevelt. Now, he didn't do it alone.
A quick shopping list. He established the United States Forest Service, signed into law the creation of 5 national parks, signed the 1906 Antiquities Act, proclaimed 18 new U.S. national monuments. And he did a lot of this by executive order.
230 million acres, one way or the other, Roosevelt set aside for permanent protection. And, of course, that was just the beginning. He would have done more if he'd had a third term or if Congress had been more willing. The Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon of Ohio, said not 1 cent for scenery. Imagine if Roosevelt had had his way. And his cousin, his 5th cousin, Franklin, went further. But the whole history of our national conservation protections really dates to Theodore Roosevelt as a public figure. And I once asked an eminent historian of the environment, Charles Wilkinson of the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I asked him, Charles, is it possible to exaggerate Roosevelt's impact as a conservationist? And he said, no, you cannot exaggerate what Roosevelt himself, this one man, did. And you and I, David, are the beneficiaries of this.
We all are.
But all of us. But we are particularly because we love Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We love the Badlands. To the extent that there is a conservation settlement in the American West, wilderness, clean air, clean water, environmental protection, the national parks, the national forests, wildlife refuges, which he invented by executive order, they pivot back on this one extraordinary individual. Now, remember when President Clinton set aside the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, the country went nuts, parts of it. Roosevelt got away with this because it was before the opposition could be formed. You couldn't do this today.
Well, I kind of suspect he could have persuaded as well. But
He was very persuasive.
We're nearing the end of this conversation. Before we leave it, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is it just received a boost from our governor, who is very much in favor of it. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Our current governor is a man named Doug Burgum. He's sort of the Steve Jobs of North Dakota.
Yeah.
He's a Republican. He's an innovator. He believes in taking the long and the broad view, and he is attempting to get $50 million from the state legislature of North Dakota from something called the Legacy Fund, the interest, to match private gifts for a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in the Badlands of North Dakota. And I wish him great success with this. I've been involved in this project from the beginning. So we'll see. Undoubtedly, there will be one. It's amazing that there is no presidential library for Theodore Roosevelt. They hadn't been invented yet. The other thing that I played a bigger role in was the creation of the digital project to digitize all of Roosevelt's papers. We're doing that at the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University. It's being headed up by a friend of mine by the name of Sharon Kilzer. She's outstanding. And we have digitized more than 1 million pages of Roosevelt, and we've fully processed with metadata more than 50,000 documents ranging from a half sheet of paper to a 300-page document. We're not going to give up until we have digitized and interpreted everything that's Rooseveltian: cartoons, photographs, scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, film, audio, you name it. If it's Rooseveltian, cartoons. If it's Rooseveltian, it will be digitized and made available 365 days a year free to everyone in the world. So these are the two elements of this: a museum that will be built in Medora, the Theodore Roosevelt National Presidential Library, and as you say, the governor has been encouraging this, and some private donors are helping to push it. It's under great leadership. It's a magnificent idea. We're going to do this. We should do this. We're North Dakota. But secondly, the digitization of Roosevelt papers, and that means that you won't have to visit North Dakota to enjoy them. They will be available to the whole world. Oh, but of course you should visit North Dakota. It's an absolutely magnificent place.
And there's a story in the Globe Newswire on the 5th of December. Doug Burgum quoted as saying it's an incredible opportunity for North Dakota, the Presidential Library. And Wendy Ross, the superintendent of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, says they remain strong advocates for the library's establishment.
Indeed.
So one way or another, we hope that gets done. So, sir, I thank you for a fine conversation about Theodore Roosevelt, and it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Theodore Roosevelt died 100 years ago. He was just 60 at the time. As he said when he determined to run South America's river of doubt against the stern warnings of the American Museum of Natural History, "Tell Osborne I have already lived and enjoyed as much of life as any 9 other men I know. I have had my full share, and if it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so." 5 years later, he died at his beloved home, Sagamore Hill, on Long Island, January 6, 1919. The books he read as a sickly child convinced him that life is an adventure that must be lived heroically. If ever a man had gusto, it was Theodore Roosevelt. He bounded up the stairs of the public buildings where he worked. He climbed the Matterhorn on his honeymoon. He trudged for 60 miles without sleep through gumbo and ice behind thieves who stole his boat in the Dakota Badlands. Roosevelt was so much larger than life that the term seems insufficient to capture his essence. A visitor said, "You go to the White House, you shake hands with Roosevelt and hear him talk, and then you go home and wring his personality out of your clothes." He set the record for shaking hands on a single day, 8,510 of them, on New Year's Day 1907 at the White House. He had himself dangled upside down over a cliff in Idaho to take a picture of a waterfall. When his friends couldn't haul him back up, he eventually cut the rope and plummeted toward the riverbed like a sack of potatoes. Fortunately, a tree broke his fall somewhat, but even Roosevelt said he was rather grievously damaged in the incident. He had a nearly eidetic memory, and he read something like a book a day. He lectured in German universities in German about German literature in 1910. When Columbia's President Nicholas Murray Butler wrote to ask him what he had been reading lately, President Roosevelt sent a list of more than 200 books, including classics of English, Russian, German, and American literature. No president in American history mentions reading and books as often as Roosevelt, not even John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. He was the most prolific writer in presidential history. He wrote approximately 40 books, not with the help of teams of researchers or ghostwriters, but in his own hand, in clear, unpretentious, muscular prose. He also wrote more than 150,000 letters, innumerable articles and op-ed pieces, and forewords to the books that embodied his interests and his worldview, including John A. Lomax's Cowboy Songs and Other Frontier Ballads, and Edward S. Curtis's The North American Indian. Theodore Roosevelt was a statesman, a politician, a reformer, a rancher, a cowboy, a civil servant, a big game hunter, a soldier, a writer, an explorer, and a family man. Almost before anyone else, Roosevelt realized that the United States was going to become the most important nation in the world, and that the 20th century was going to be the American century. He carried the American people into the 20th century, sometimes kicking and screaming, advocated and helped to build a big navy, sent the entire U.S. Navy on a round-the-world friendship cruise, successfully brokered an end to the Russo-Japanese War, formulated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, dug the Panama Canal, and won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American president to do so. Of course he had faults. He could be a bully. He could be righteous. As a young man, he flirted with the eugenics movement. He said nasty things about American Indians. He was paternalistic with respect to African Americans, and in 1906, he not only jumped to unjust conclusions about a race incident in South Texas, but stubbornly refused to revisit the incident when it became clear to everyone, including himself, that he had been unfair. He demonized his political enemies. He had a Manichaean view of life, assumed always that he was on the side of virtue. Speaker of the House Thomas Reed said, "What I most admire about you, Theodore, is your original discovery of the Ten Commandments." He fought for the United States in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, offered to fight in half a dozen other potential American conflicts during his lifetime, and went hat in hand to his enemy President Wilson in 1917, seeking one last chance to lead a crew of harum-scarum Rough Riders into the fighting fields of France. President Wilson told him he was too old, war was no longer a romantic business, that he should leave World War I to the professionals. Bitter, aware now that his vitality was nearly spent, he pushed his 4 sons into the war and insisted that they find their way to the front. All were wounded. One, his youngest and favorite, Quentin, did not return. TR became the Theodore Roosevelt of American memory and mythology out in the Badlands of North Dakota. Along the banks of the Little Missouri River, in a broken landscape that reminded him of the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe, Roosevelt underwent a transformation from a physically fragile, socially conscious dandy and New York dude into America's greatest exemplar of the strenuous life. Out among the buttes and the cottonwoods, Roosevelt learned to admire the men and women of the American heartland, honest, unpretentious, not particularly refined, outstanding in a crisis, solid, courageous, and hard-working. It can be said that Roosevelt's square deal was born on the frontier along the Montana-Dakota border. It was here, he said in 1900, that the romance of my life began. Along the way, and partly at his Elkhorn Ranch in the Dakota Badlands, Roosevelt became the greatest conservationist in American presidential history. He invented the National Wildlife Refuge System, established 5 new national parks, set aside 150 million acres of national forest, designated the first 18 national monuments, including the Grand Canyon, created national game preserves, co-founded the Boone and Crockett Club, and played a key role in the saving of the buffalo from extinction. He was an indefatigable, unrelenting, sometimes exhausting figure in American life. In the course of his 60 years, as he reveled in the glory of work and the joy of living, he did a great deal of unnecessary damage to his body. The 2 culminating blows were an assassin's bullet in the last days of the 1912 Bull Moose campaign, and an array of fevers and infections that finally put him on his back in the Amazon jungle 2 years later. The River of Doubt shortened Roosevelt's life by a decade, his sister Corinne said. Still, When he died quietly in his sleep at Sagamore Hill, Vice President Thomas R. Marshall said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he'd been awake, there would have been a fight." I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.